So welcome everyone to our webinar today with the topic Taking Stock of Progress Against the Roadmap to Net Zero 2024. I'll just wait one more minute for people to join and then we'll kick off the webinar. Oops. Okay, so let's start with our webinar, the first of our Q3 engagement days at AII, with the topic Taking Stock of Progress Against the Roadmap to Net Zero 2024. Welcome everyone who's participating today. My name is Leonie and I'm the Director of Sustainability Reporting at AII. Just for a quick introduction, who we are at AII, for the ones that do not know us very well, we are a global nonprofit whose mission is to identify, fund, scale, and measure positive impact for textile, apparel, and footwear industry supply chain. And therefore, we work together with many stakeholders to deploy solutions to decarbonize the apparel industry. And we are here today in our role as convener of the Roadmap to Net Zero report in collaboration with Textile Exchange, Scale, and Industry We Want. We're happy to have in our webinar today great speakers with kicking off with Michael Sadowski, advisor to the Apparel Impact Institute and the author of the report, with Joelle Mertens, the director of HIG Product Tools at Cascale, Mallory McConnell from PVH, Vice President of Corporate Sustainability. And our agenda for today is that we're going to kick off with running through our Taking Stock of Progress 2024 update report. We'll talk about the results and also show a few kind of like brands of the industry and their progress towards our industry goal. And then we're lucky to have PVH today to speak a bit more from a brand perspective of all the great work that they've been doing and the goals they have set as well. And last but not least, we'll have a quick introduction as well to the Apparel Impact Institute's decarbonization initiatives. And we'll close the session with a Q&A where you should, on the one hand, now, while we already start the webinar, can use the Q&A function to raise any questions that might come up while you listen to the speakers. But if not, at the end of the session, please do raise your questions and we will forward them to the speakers and hope we can get everything answered. So I'll hand over to Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Leonie, and good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you're calling from. As Leonie mentioned, my name is Michael Sadowski. I've been involved with the roadmap report from the beginning. So this is the third report that we've put out. We started with the World Resources Institute and AII, and then AII has taken forward the last two reports. So we're really pleased to share the results with you and just to have a conversation about the results. And as Leonie mentioned, would love for you to add questions and comments using the Q&A function, and we'll address those as we go through. So Leonie, next slide, please. Okay, so just some context. And, you know, I think this is not a surprise, you know, really wherever you are in the world that we're seeing the impacts of climate change now. This topic that maybe 10, 20 years ago, we were talking about future impacts. We are seeing, you know, record temperature increases, heat-related deaths, other impacts, you know, hunger, water shortages, et cetera. Things that we talked about coming are here with us. And so, you know, frankly, there are a lot of negative headlines happening. But Leonie, if you go to the next slide, I would say that there are also some positive things that we're seeing, right? So, you know, things like EV sales, you know, growing every year at a considerable rate. We're seeing big increases in renewable energy in different parts of the world. We're seeing companies set bold climate targets and achieving those targets. We're seeing companies commit real money towards next generation preferred materials like H&M has done and others have done. And so there's a lot of negative headlines, and yet there is some progress that we're seeing. So we want to make sure that we're presenting a balanced view and not everything is bad in where we are. And yet, of course, we do have work to do. So next slide, Leonie, please. Okay. So as I mentioned, this is the third installment of the Roadmap to Net Zero. We kicked off on the left-hand side with World Resources Institute and AII, and this was the first report that we put out. And we really, at that time, set out to create a repeatable report that we would put out every year, that we would refresh the data so that we could keep track of how we're doing as a sector. And we published a refresh of that last year. And on this webinar, we'll talk about the 2024 report. And so again, the goal was to use a consistent set of data and also to refine the assumptions that we're making in the report over time. I think we all know that the quality of the data in the apparel sector, even though I would say it's probably better than many other sectors, there are still some gaps that we're trying to fill. And so every year we're trying to make our analysis stronger as we do this work. Next slide, please. Yeah. So from the first report, we've taken a similar approach. So we're basically using data from what we believe are two of the best sources that are out there. So fiber volume data from Textile Exchange. So every year Textile Exchange publishes a report. That's an excellent report that includes, how much cotton, how much recycled cotton, how much recycled poly is used by the industry. So we're taking fiber volume from Textile Exchange, and then we're taking emissions factors from the Higg MSI, and we're essentially just cascading those two figures throughout the value chain. So we're starting with, how many tons of cotton are used, and then we're taking that and multiplying that by the emissions factors for tier 4, which is raw materials, and then down the line from raw material processing all the way up to finished product assembly. And so this is the approach that we've taken from the beginning. And again, what we're doing is refining this over time and editing assumptions where we have better data. So this is the approach we've taken. Next slide, please, Leonie. And just a reminder of the limitations that we have really put out from the beginning, right? That we're using emissions factors from a secondary data set, and I'm sure we have some life cycle assessment folks on the call. Like, we know the limitations in this, right? That these may not be representative of actual industry practices. These are industry averages. And so we know that's a limitation. And over time, the goal is to bring in more primary data and get more representative data. So we know that. We also know that secondary data doesn't allow companies or the sector to, perfectly track performance over time. But again, like, the goal is to swap out secondary data and bring in more primary data as we go through this. And so we've been pretty transparent about this from the beginning. And as we'll talk about in a moment, we think the data gives us a really good sense of the magnitude of emissions for the sector, but also where those emissions lie across the value chain. So next slide, Leonie, please. So there's a time lag with our data because of when Textile Exchange comes out with their report. So our latest report has 2022 data. So this is the calendar year 2022 figure. Total emissions were 878 million tons, so 0.879 gigatons. And similar to previous reports, we know where the hotspots of emissions are. So about 55% of total emissions sit within material production. So, the knitting, the weaving, the dyeing, the finishing, that is a really carbon intensive piece of the value chain. And as we can talk about in a moment, much of that comes in the form of thermal energy. So this is not necessarily electricity. This is coal on site to generate steam, generate heat, etc. So that's the big piece of emissions, and this has been consistent throughout the 3 reports that we've put out. Second is tier 4, so extraction of raw materials. So cotton farming, extracting fossil fuels from the ground to make synthetics, that's just over a fifth of emissions, and that's followed by tier 3 and then tier 1. So again, as I mentioned, the total number is about 8.78 million tons, excuse me, 0.879 gigatons. But the distribution has been pretty similar to previous years. So we know where the hotspots are. We'll talk in a moment about what companies are doing to address those. So next slide, please. Joelle, I may ask you, Cascale and Worldly have been our partners for a big piece of this. And so maybe you can just speak to some of the data changes that we saw from 2021 to 2022.
Yeah, so thanks, Michael. So we talked about the limitations a few slides ago, and using LCA data does have some limitations. However, LCA data does have primary data components associated with it. So that's part of the changes that we're seeing is how do we get more primary data into these calculations. So when we look at this, one of the changes here, like we talk about cotton, we have more updated primary data from Cotton Made in Africa. There was updated data there. We're expecting to see more updated cotton data in the future. So we're working with cotton producers to refine the kind of modeling requirements that we have to get more program level data into the HigMSI. And then there's the background changes that also happen. So this year there were some pretty significant ones. So I think it's worth kind of pausing and just going through what the implications of those are when we look at this report. So the first is the global warming impact method was updated from the AR5 to AR6 method. And what this means is, the IPCC kind of on an ongoing basis, but really significantly between AR5 and AR6, they say, hey, based on the best available data, this is the emission factor for these individual chemical substances. So of course, CO2 is always held as one, but the emission factor for methane or the emission factor for different refrigerants, as better data is collected by those scientists, it's reflected into the emission factors. So in this case, we updated from the AR5 emission factors, which, if memory serves, were originally published in 2006, but then there wasn't a midterm update to the 2019 AR. Sorry, AR5 was 2006. AR6 was revised in 2019, or thereabouts. My year might be slightly off. The implications of this is that most data sets reduce their emission intensity by about 2%. That was the average. We do see some data sets that had slightly higher reductions. Those are largely animal fibers that have high amounts of biogenic methane. So if leather and I'd say leather is the significant one, which doesn't affect these calculations because we don't have leather in this calculation. So when we look at the implication of revising the global warming potential method, it's pretty similar to what we see with other background updates. It's about 1 or 2% change. So when we look at this reduction year on year, some of that is just due to better data about the substances themselves. Other background data changes really impacted many synthetic materials where the impacts to make certain precursor materials were also revised downward due to better data on efficiencies within the refining process itself. One change that isn't reflected here that we will expect to see in the future, just to head off some questions, because I'm sure that somebody would be asking about it, and if not, it's a good question to ask or to know anyways. There are updated fugitive methane emission factors for the fossil fuel industry. Those will be reflected in a future data update once those have been integrated into the LCA database that we're using, which it now is. So later this year, when we look at the next report, those changes in fugitive methane measurements will be reflected into the emission changes. And I think that's a pretty good thing to reflect on here when we talk about Scope 3 emissions. Of course, primary data on everything is hard to define, because when we're talking about primary data, right, there's primary data for the emission factors, there's primary data for the fugitive methane emissions, and these are things that are well beyond our industry, but they do fit into these primary data sources into the LCA data, though we can sometimes bucket them under the blanket of secondary data because they are still representing an average scenario for that specific thing. So we're seeing a lot of actual changes to better data coming through the LCA space. We expect more of that to continue. As mentioned, I think we're expecting to see some new cotton data for our next report as well. And yeah, the last thing I'll say, okay, so all these revisions, many of them were downwards. Why are we still seeing only a small change? Why is it mostly flat? And that's because the fiber volume was up 3%. So yes, our emissions intensity went down because we have more renewables. That is reflected in here as the grid improves, as the efficiency of making different precursor materials improves. All of these are reducing our emissions intensity. But then as we use more fiber, that kind of counterbalances those changes. And I think that was a pretty good high level overview. If there's more questions, we can take those at the end. Thanks. I'll turn it back to you, Michael.
Yeah, that was great, Joel. Thank you. And again, we make these assumptions and our edits public in the report. So we're trying to just improve this over time. So again, we know the data has some gaps, but we are improving the data over time, and always coming with a stronger figure from year to year. So thanks for that, Joel. Leonie, next slide, please. So again, in the report, we've been tracking, where we are and what would emissions be to 2030, which is kind of that first milestone for, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so, if we continue on a business as usual pathway, we'd go from 0.879 gigatons to 1.243 gigatons. So in the report, we lay out our assumptions of growth. But we have to get down to 0.489 gigatons if we want to stay within that 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. So I would say we're kind of, as you can see in the graph, we're kind of staying flat, but then we've got a pretty big wedge to take out if we want to stay within that relatively safe trajectory. Next slide, please, Leonie. I think Leonie mentioned this. So our figure has been an input to the Industry We Want industry dashboard. And so the dashboard has 3 metrics, one on wages, one on purchasing practices, and one on greenhouse gas emissions. Every year we're contributing our figure to that. And so, this is being used to kind of track progress and hold companies accountable for reducing emissions. Next slide. So I'll just share some examples of maybe why we should have some optimism for what we're doing as a sector. I mean, I think the first slide I showed were kind of negative headlines, but I do think there's a lot of good work happening in the sector. I'm going to give some examples, and no doubt folks on the call could give others, and Mallory will speak to the good work that PVH is doing. But when we started this work, when I was at WRI back in 2019, there were about a dozen companies with science-based targets or commitments to set them. And 5 years later, we're at over 500, and this is just a selection. So to see that explosion of growth of companies that are committed is fantastic. I think the apparel sector is probably the sector with the most companies with approvals and commitments. So it's great work by the sector. So I think that's a really positive thing. Next slide, Leonie. I think, we see this, that brands are reducing supply chain emissions, obviously working with their manufacturing partners to do so. I'm just showing a few examples here, of companies that are actually making, real reductions in scope 3. And as you all know, scope 3 for a brand is the vast majority of emissions. Generally over 80% of total emissions are scope 3. And so, whether it's an H&M reducing scope 3 emissions 22% and setting a bold goal for 2030, or Puma reducing emissions on an absolute basis, this is a lot of work. It's a lot of investment. It's a lot of technical support. It's a lot of work on the manufacturer side. So I think we should applaud examples like this and others of companies that are actually taking good steps to reduce emissions. Next slide, Leonie, please. Yeah. Actually, Leonie, this is an AI side, so maybe you can just speak to this briefly.
Yeah, so also from the AI side, we can add to the number here for factories that are actually reducing energy consumption. We had, at the end of 2023, 300 producers that completed a so-called impact program, which we call all of those programs that actually create emission reductions. We have a variety of different programs that the big kind of like part of it focuses on the low-hanging fruits, and therefore we have quite short payback period, which you can see here. That's on average 12 months. You can see that the average actual investment per facility in US dollar was about the same than the average actual savings per facility in US dollar, around 450,000 per year in 2023. And that brings us to an overall cost when you look at actually how much would a facility and a brand spend on reducing the ton per CO2e. In a facility, the average actual cost is about 22 US dollar. And that comes on the one hand from the facility side, which is about 16 US dollar, and the AII costs are about 6 US dollar. So that's just an example of how facilities are reducing energy consumption with a quite good return on investment program from AI side.
Excellent.
I'll hand over to you again, Michael.
Great. Again, more of supply chain examples, but companies are deploying renewable energy, right? So whether it's bestseller in H&M, investing in offshore wind in Bangladesh, Decathlon, this example of working with partners to do a PPA in China, Moss in Sri Lanka adding rooftop solar. If you're on the call and you have operations in Vietnam, you might have seen the news last week about the power purchase agreement policy regime finally being approved. I think that's been in the works for a decade. I worked on that literally in like 2015, so that's a huge deal. So this is only going to get faster. Obviously, there's work to do. There's still more coal being added to the grid, but I think this is all positive. And with the right policy, I think we'll see more of this. So this is happening and it's starting to scale. Next slide, Leonie, please. Also, in the report, we talked about so-called next generation materials. So these are the materials, at the next level beyond like recycled polyester from PET bottles. We're seeing kind of big bets and big investments, things like, H&M and Vargas kind of standing up this new company, Cira, to scale textile recycling for polyester and putting real money towards this. So I think this is a huge deal. We're seeing investments in bio-based materials like this Haosung example with Gino. We're seeing companies, committing to biomaterial, whether Inditex, Moss from Ambercycle, again, recycled poly from textiles. So there are a lot of examples of this. I think over the past 10 years, there have been a lot of examples that have been small or waiting for these things to get to a certain scale. I think we're now starting to see these things, real money is being put towards these next generation materials, and we need this, right? We need to take that wedge of carbon out of the value chain. Next slide, Leonie, please. This one is hard. I mentioned tier 2 is primarily a thermal coal challenge, but you have companies that are committing to get out of coal. I just put up 3 here. So companies are exploring alternatives. Some intermediates could be biomass or gas where that is viable, but those are intermediate steps. And so you have companies that are looking at electrification. And this is a challenge. It's going to require a lot of money. You have companies that are putting money into this and testing alternatives, but it's going to take time. It's going to take technology developed for other sectors. But companies are stepping up and committing to getting out of coal and making it happen. And these are just 3 examples of that. So that for me was just a way to share some quick examples of what, some of the progress we're seeing. And I know, Mallory, you can maybe go into some more detail about what PBH is doing.
Yeah.
So I'll pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. So happy to spend a little bit of time today talking, I think, about PBH's both footprint, how we're looking at our data, and then using that to really target specific activities and initiatives, both for our owned and operated operations, but certainly for our supply chain as well. So just to set the scene in terms of our targets and baseline data, this is kind of hot off the press, but really have, I would say, kind of 3 targets that we're trying to hit. One is really around our own and operated, so really thinking about how do we power our offices, distribution centers, and stores with 100% renewable electricity, and then really looking at driving a 42% reduction in our Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We've also just recently launched a net zero commitment. So really looking to hit that by 24. So kind of these are really, I think, the guideposts that we're holding ourselves to and where we're looking to go. Also, what's helpful, I think, is to really understand from our footprint, where are we seeing our largest emissions and how does this actually start to play out? So this kind of is our snapshot of our global emissions across the board, but you'll really see out of our total emissions, 87% of that really comes from our purchased goods and services. When we start to break that down further, you'll see, another, I want to say 50-ish% are really coming from our raw materials. And then a significant portion coming from our tier 2s and our tier 1s as well. So, as we started to think, where are the actual levers that we can start to pull to drive the largest impact the fastest, those two kind of key areas come to the surface. So one, really thinking about how do we look at our materials and think about what our current state, midterm state, and future state targets around that. And the rest looking really at what can we do in our supply chain and how do we start to foster some improvement there. So as we started to look at focus areas for reducing our emissions, really, again, as I said, we have, I think, some key areas that we can start to look at in terms of pulling, we call those levers, if you will. So really around 39% of our opportunity, again, comes from our tier 1 and our tier 2 supply chain. So really thinking about what are the activities that need to happen in both of those spaces to drive reductions. Again, the largest bucket then after our supply chain is really going to come from materials. So thinking about beyond our sort of current and traditional materials, what are the next gen and innovations that we need to start to place in? We do have other areas around transportation, around our own operations, around packaging. And while these don't represent a huge opportunity for reduction, they are areas where we have really good direct control. So it also kind of come into the space in terms of the levers that we're trying to drive. Then if you can go to the next slide, just kind of talking again at the highest level about some of the activities that we have in this. So in terms of actions to date, when we think about our supply chain, we really work with our suppliers to make sure that they have the right data and the right action plans for them to think about what's going to work for their operations in terms of reducing emissions. So we've worked through organizations like AII and Cascale to really equip all of our vendors to say, look, you need to have a baseline and have calculated your own footprint. You need to have a target that's set in science. And then have an action plan that we can help follow up on and kind of engage with you on a quarterly basis to understand what actions are you going to take and how's it going, and really getting a good feedback loop there to understand where are you making great progress, where do you have roadblocks, and how can we help to maybe start to remove or look at those roadblocks together. As Michael said, coal is obviously a area that we want to continue to push in terms of internal and purchasing policy. So really thinking about how do we eliminate coal from our manufacturing. So we, I want to say 2022, started to establish a ban on coal for new facilities. So any facility that wanted to be onboarded into the PVH supply chain had to be coal free. So not trying to grow our coal problem. And we'll look to expand that to existing facilities as thermal innovation kind of takes off and we have some good substitutes for coal there. And then really looking at energy efficiency within our supply chain as well. We've been big supporters of the AII impact programs for a long time. Love a good industry approach to things like energy efficiency. So making sure that our suppliers either have access to programs that help them identify areas where they can reduce the amount of energy they're using, or bring some of that expertise in-house when appropriate. And then really, I think a lot of the work that has to happen in this space, especially in the supply chain, is really focused on, how do we get really good ideas out of kind of innovation and into commercialization. So we partnered with AII to help launch the Fashion Climate Fund, which really was intended to support the climate solutions portfolio, but really thinking about, as we have all these great ideas that are starting to float out into the market, how do we have almost like a marketplace of things that are tested, vetted, proven for impact that we can start to point our suppliers to as a key resource for them as they're thinking about investments that they need to make. So really excited about that work. As we think about kind of the next steps in this space, it's really around, I think, some of the bigger ecosystem needs that we're starting to see. So, we'll look at adoption of renewable energy and really thinking about what are the roadmaps in our key sourcing countries, whether those are VPPAs that are available or on-site generation where policy is and I'd say fiscal realities are conducive to that. Similarly, thinking about thermal heat, that's a huge impact for our supply chain, and one that I think we haven't, as an industry, started to crack yet. So thinking about what kind of innovation is needed there, and you know, as you start to think about an organization like ours that works in, I want to say, 50 plus production countries, those roadmaps look different per region, per place. So really thinking about making sure that we're asking the right asks of each supplier in the right regions based on what's technically feasible there. Kind of connected to that, then there's obviously policy and advocacy work that needs to happen in some of our key sourcing countries, really thinking about both grid decarbonization, but also having kind of a regulatory environment that's conducive to things like on-site renewables. And then connected to all of that is really thinking about how does this get financed? And so really thinking about how we provide incentives and platforms where our suppliers can have access to capital to make some of these investments that we're going to need to see. When we drop down then into the environmentally preferred materials, you know, to date, we've focused really on scaling sustainable materials across some of our key materials used here at PBH. So we're a big cotton company, have made commitments that 100% of our cotton will be sustainably sourced by 2025, also including viscose and wool in that, and then really looking at 100% of polyester by 2030. As we start to think about what next steps are really in our material space, you know, again, it's how do we start to evolve those 2025 targets that really are going to focus on carbon reductions. But I think, Michael, to your point, that really go beyond, I would say, some of the traditional fiber, sustainable fiber categories, but think about next generation materials and how we start to commit to those in a meaningful way. So I just wanted, again, to give kind of the highest level overview of some of the actions that we're taking, but happy to answer questions about that or dig in further where there's interest.
Yeah. And just to say, there are a couple of really good questions that have come in. We'll hold those for the end, as well as any others that have come up from Mallory's slides. But really appreciate the questions so far. I think we'll go back to Leonie for a wrap up here.
Yeah, thanks everyone already for the great introduction to our report of this year and the great work that PBH has been doing and is doing until the kind of like reduction goal to come up in 2030 and going forward. And I'm just here now to close off the kind of like part of the webinar in presenting and giving a short overview of the Apparel Impact Institute's decarbonization initiatives. Just to give you kind of like a big summary of the work that we've been doing by the end of 2023, we've launched our impact report. And as the key actions that have happened and the key results that we have achieved, we would like to just note out that we had actually seen a huge increase in producers that have started a new program with AII that focuses on reduction emissions. So whereas the Roadmap to Net Zero report obviously shows numbers from 2022, we have seen that 2023 shows quite a big increase. So we're expecting to see results of those by 2024. We also launched our strategy to enable the reduction of 100 megatons CO2e, which is a very ambitious goal, but we want to obviously do our part in reducing the emissions in the industry. And as the key results, we have also quadrupled our actual GHG emissions reductions in 2023 compared to 2022. So we definitely see already an increase from 2022 to 2023. And looking at more detailed into our data, we can see here the goal that I just mentioned, that we have set a very ambitious goal to reduce, well, to enable the reduction of 100 megatons CO2 emissions through our own programs and through the Climate Solutions portfolio as well. So at the moment, we're kind of like at the top of the huge mountain or iceberg that we have in front of us. We're only at about 5.6% of the goal achieved. But we do see in the kind of like table at the bottom that we have constantly sort of tried to increase further our CO2 emissions reductions, with a slight kind of decrease during the COVID times when facilities were shut and we just couldn't do any work during that time. So those savings equate in 2023, just to give you a bit of an understanding and maybe imagine a bit better how much GHG emission savings we created. Those were equal to about 42,000 cars removed from the roads, about 1,450 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water filled, and about 11,000 washing machines that weren't used in 2023. And how do we implement, like, how do we actually work at AII? So we follow a decarbonization methodology where we start with different phases. We start with a benchmarking phase to understand a carbon reduction potential and the maturity level in the facility. We then support the facility to set their targets. Move forward then to the implementation phase, where we go into different portfolios of different programs that we offer depending on what makes most sense in the facility. And finally, we look at the monitoring, so sort of just measuring as well how those targets have been achieved. And we are also looking for the future. We're right now in a concept phase to validate those data created in the programs. To give you a bit of an understanding where we are active, we have quite a broad spectrum of countries where we work in. In 2024, so far, we've been active mainly in El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, and USA. In Europe, we are focusing a lot on Italy. And then in Asia and Southeast Asia, we're mainly focusing on China, Taiwan, Pakistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. But really going forward, looking a lot to expand in the main kind of like producing countries of India, Bangladesh, and China. And last but not least, to understand as well, going forward, how we want to focus and how we want to achieve that very ambitious goal, we're looking at prioritizing our suppliers and the strategy how to kind of like reach out to them. We're working to identify who are the highest emitters and work there together with Cascale and Reset recently to identify who are the highest emitters and who we should reach out to. And we actually identified that there are about top 1,500 facilities that contribute to around 78% of the total emissions. So those are definitely the suppliers we're going to be and producers we're going to be focusing on going forward. Then we also looked at the regions, which I just mentioned as well. So China, Bangladesh, India, but then also looking at Turkey, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Indonesia, which are the top 7 regions that have created, that have the highest emissions. And last but not least, then after that, we would like to obviously look at scaling and standardizing programs to make sure we just support those solutions and don't let them be stuck at the kind of like seed phase. So that was it from AII side, really just a very quick introduction to the work we're doing and how we support producers and brands on the kind of like path to reducing the CO2 emissions. And we're very happy to receive questions from the audience. I can see there have been
yeah, there've been a few questions which are great. I'll kind of tick through them, and if others have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. So there's a question about whether there are plans to incorporate primary FEM data for tier 1 and tier 2. Joel, maybe I'll start just to say like that is a goal of ours to bring in more primary data. I think, you know, the FEM is only getting more robust over time, and there's just an amazing set of data in there. So ultimately, we do want to bring in more of that so that we can actually see, you know, direct factory, you know, reductions flowing into our figures. But Joel, maybe you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually touch on 2 different elements here. And the first, I'd say, is a call out for anybody, if you haven't read it or accessed it yet. The UNFCCC published a guidance for measuring greenhouse gas emissions for purchased goods and services for the apparel and footwear industry last year. And there's several different approaches that kind of fit under that umbrella, right? How you use supplier-specific data, how you use average data, how you can adjust, you know, facility data with average data and kind of bring them all together. So why I'm bringing this up, of course, is first off, we're talking about Scope 3 emissions. So it's I think a good thing to consider here when we're talking about the apparel industry's footprint. That is ultimately a Scope 3 footprint that we're looking at, right? It includes all of that upstream impact data. So number one is, what can we actually enter right now? And one of the limitations with the emission factors, or the way that we have the emission factors in the MSI right now, is that they are fully aggregated data sets. And what that means is that, let's say that I know that I'm using renewable energy for for whatever process, I can't substitute that in because everything is aggregated together. So the first step that we're working on is disaggregating that data. And of course, different data sets, that's easier than others. And some data sets, it won't make sense to disaggregate, right? If we already have supplier specific information in there, we don't need to disaggregate that. But for a lot of the processes that we're using for this calculation, disaggregation will let us start to reflect in choices like what happens if I have more renewable energy in my supply chain, and we can use some of the FEM data to leverage assumptions around that to build in better, more granular industry level assumptions. I think there's a layer of how we actually do that, right? Because FEM doesn't represent every facility across the industry. So what percentage we update, that is going to be part of the work that we'll have to figure out when we get to that stage. But it is part of the process. And I do think why, again, back to the measuring scope 3 emissions, it's also not as simple as just taking FEM results and plugging them into the calculations. That when we look at it, it's actually, when you look at your supplier specific data, it includes your scope 1 and 2 emissions from that facility, but also your scope 3 emissions from that facility. So what are we not including in FEM, right? What is the energy required to make the chemical inputs? What is the energy required to get scope 3 energy emissions, right? It's, if we look at like burning natural gas, the footprint of burning natural gas is different than the footprint of extracting that natural gas, compressing it into a pipeline, compressing it to liquefied natural gas if you're in a place that's using liquefied natural gas, transporting. I think you get the point, but those elements all have to be factored in here. So it is in work, as Michael alluded to. The first step is that disaggregation that is well underway, and then we'll get into the kind of more nuance of how do we actually start to layer in better primary sources of what is actually happening in the supply chain and reflecting that through. Oh, I do have one other point on that. Seeing how we have the time, I'll elaborate a little further too. And the other is how we prevent double counting as we go along that. And that's one of the challenges a lot of times with LCAs and specifically around purchase power agreements, where at a specific level, I can start to track that and say, like, look at what I've done here. But if that renewable energy is also counted towards country grid mixes, which is often the case for anything that, when we look at, okay, how much renewables coming on the grids, we can end up with situations with double counting. So really, there's a lot that we can explore in the future. And as we get more primary data and the ability to use that primary data, reflecting it in is going to make the numbers hopefully more accurate, but it also changes the limitations that we'll have to explore or how we articulate them.
Just maybe one thing to add on to that, maybe just from more of the brand side in terms of how we think about primary data and our footprint. So, I think in this team, I think this is a great question because we've had this conversation internally, right, around if we're using model data, then how are we going to ever show reductions from programs that we're working with our facilities on? And I think there's been a few different things that have come to light for us that we've had to kind of tackle. We do use primary tier 1 data in our footprint. So we have kind of FEM coming in, and I know Pascal and Worldly have been thinking and working a lot on like, how do we make sure that we have more real-time data as we look at emissions so that we're not kind of experiencing a lag between reporting years and the actual years that our emissions are calculated. So I think that's one challenge that we've been looking at. As we started to drop into, I would say, further tiers of our supply chain, I think there's been kind of a couple issues here. One is just around like, do we have FEM at all of our L2s, or do we even know who all of our tier 2s are and tier 3s are? And do we have the right level of traceability to understand when we apply a primary or secondary data source to that? And then the second, I would say, just also having really good business data, especially at our tier 2s, right? So if we don't know exactly how much material is being produced from PBH for that facility, it becomes really challenging for us to do an accurate calculation, both of reductions, but of overall emissions. So I think kind of the two areas that we focus on as we think about primary versus secondary is really around visibility, traceability, and having the right business data at each partner so that we can actually reflect both savings and emissions accurately.
Yeah, and Mallory, that might be a good segue to a question from Shohail. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly, but the question is really, I think, around like, we all know that the vast majority of manufacturing is happening in Asia, Southeast Asia, countries where the energy mix is not so clean, right? And so like, how do we think about incentivizing, even policing manufacturers so that they can actually transition to cleaner forms of energy? I'll just say that, in some places there are just some structural hurdles, right? I mentioned the Vietnam thing, the policy regime, which was a hurdle to getting to more renewables. So that has to be addressed. Like, how's PBH thinking about supporting factories and kind of getting them towards this, goal?
Yeah, and I would say that I do think about it from kind of two angles of like, how do we start to raise the bar as kind of like, what are our minimum expectations and 2024 in terms of what good looks like? And then how do we start to incentivize, I would say, investments?
Yeah.
But then I think there's also this ecosystem question, right? That's where I think really policy, technology, innovation sits. So I think for the most part, we have tried to, again, because we operate in 50 plus countries, and each of those countries have their own nuances to things like payback periods, even regulatory environments that support this. And so I think when we started to go out and say, like, could we do a one size fits all model, like that doesn't work with things like especially renewable energy adoption. I think you layer on just challenges around, can you do things on site, or can you do purchasing agreements? Are there the right technologies for storage? So I think we've been kind of thinking about, one, how do we make sure that our suppliers have the resources they need to understand the dynamics that they're operating in, and create action plans that are appropriate to where they are. And then really trying to get the right information to us to say, like, how can we then help to support that? I think that then leads us into these conversations around looking at industry roadmaps so that we're all, as even brands, asking the same things of suppliers, so that we're not kind of sending mixed messages around, okay, move out of coal, but should you go to biomass? So one brand says no, the other says go straight to electrification, you're in a dirty grid. And so really thinking about, looking at things like AII, who I know is coming out with a few roadmaps in hopefully the coming months around, for thermal, like what is the actual condition and sort of technical feasibility in each sourcing country for some of those adoptions. And I think the same within renewable electricity. And then the last piece I would say is really, again, on this like policy and commercial feasibility space, right? So, I think there's a lot of great organizations that are really focused in on policy and how do we all start to get rallied behind making the right asks of regulators so that we're creating more of an enabling environment within the countries that we operate in. But I think the other piece is really around, there's a lot of technologies or innovations that maybe aren't at a commercial scale within the apparel industry. And so how do we start to think about either bringing things over, really getting them to a place where they economically make sense, they provide the same level of quality or temperatures or whatever it is that we're looking for, and that they can actually be adopted by the supply chain. So, there are huge investment costs that go into making that a reality. And I think trying to think about how we use some of our resources to help support that as well.
Yeah, awesome. I'll just flag that the Transformers Foundation put out a report a couple months ago. I think at least I saw Matthew from TAL on this call, and you all were involved. But just laying out the various ways in which investment could be made to support manufacturers. Again, we know that's where the emissions are. We also know that there's money necessary, right? We're not going to get to, net zero in any sector without funding innovations and efficiency and other things. So I think that's a really good report from the manufacturer lens of what's needed. So check out that report. I'll just kind of tick through another questions. Plans to expand programs for leather. Nothing yet. We would love to in the future. We don't have footwear in our analysis because we just don't have great data on some basic things like, how many pairs of footwear are made in a given year. So ultimately we would love that, but we'll hopefully have that in the future. There's a question about the fact that we use industry average, and do we have, a deviation range around that average? We have not done that. Joel, I don't even know like if that's even possible in the future or what that would bring to the work. But
so
any thoughts on that? Yeah.
So not really. I'd say there's a lot. It's more complicated than it looks on the surface. There's, of course, ways you can do like a Monte Carlo simulation with different scenarios, but unless we have we have so many layers of assumptions with the data already that all of it is directional. So
Yeah.
what we can say is out of the variables that we're looking at and including, what is the trajectory that we're on? And that's where, as we include more specific primary variables, that's where we'll have a more specific answer and have more ability to do these in the future. However, what does it change, I think, is the other question. What, as the model gets more
Yeah.
specific, what really changes? And I think actually the parallel from early climate models is a good analog here to say, the early climate models, there was a lot of questions. Is cloud cover reflectivity modeled correctly? Is this feedback loop included? And the models have gotten better over time, but by and large, what those early models said have remained true. So the levers that we have for change of like coal phase out or increased renewable energy adoption, are those going to change based on better data? Probably not. Can we get more specific around the actions that have happened and get to a better result in the future? I think yes. I did want to just quickly jump back to the leather one too, and just say, when we look at leather too, I think we have to recognize that most of the emissions for leather are tied to the cattle raising phase. So, a lot of what we're looking at with renewable adoption or coal phase out, of course, would reduce the impacts of leather, but so much of the leather footprint is tied to cattle. We have to look and say, well, what actually can be done there? And of course, deforestation is a big one that is very real and needs to be continued to improve. But given those realities of like most of the reason we're raising cattle is for meat, the leather aspect, and this ties not only to leather, I'd say this applies to any choice we make. What actually is the consequence of a decision? What happens? What can we do to make that better? Which again goes back to these variables.
Yep. Okay. There was a question about our thinking beyond energy to support initiatives in countries like India, Bangladesh around water, wastewater management. I mean, Leonie, I think you spoke to this a bit in the work that AAI is doing, right? That you're not just addressing carbon, you're addressing things like water as well. I don't know if there's anything you want to say on that.
Yeah, so we do have different programs in kind of our portfolio, but our main program is the Clean by Design program, which focuses on energy efficiency. We do have also a Clean by Design program that focuses more on chemical management. And then there are side parts which focus as well on water reduction as part of those programs. But we do expand our program portfolio, so there will be coming up other programs that focus on different areas. So more to come in the near future.
Yeah, and Leonie, there's a question about who's paying for the actual investments to support decarbonization. Obviously, the answer to that is varied depending on the manufacturer, depending on the company. But I think brands are putting money up. I think manufacturers are putting their own money up. I think there are funds like AAI that brands are supporting that are funding this work. So it's varied, right?
Exactly. So there, like you kind of summarized it, there are different ways and models. There's always the technical kind of like support part of it, which is like technical experts coming in and running the programs, giving the advices what needs to be done. That can happen directly by the brand or manufacturer brand collaborations. And there's also the funding part. And then we have the investment itself that currently happens mainly by the facilities, but we also have a new program coming up, or new programs where IAI is helping to collaborate together with banks and other institutions to support facilities to get that funding in a better and easier way. So
great. There's an anonymous attendee that said, there's huge pushback from manufacturers to adopt new technologies. They hate changes, and brands don't want to influence much because of fear of breaking business relations. I mean, we obviously don't have a manufacturer on this panel. We know there are some on the line. At least in my experience, this maybe is not the case. Like, you actually have manufacturers making changes because they are seeing the impacts of climate firsthand. They're seeing opportunity to save money. They are seeing the need to reduce emissions for their own reasons. And I don't know, I think the fact that there are over 500 companies with commitments and approvals, many of more and more of them are manufacturers. I'm not sure I see this. I mean, certainly there's work to be done, there's investment, but I don't know, Mallory or Leonie, like, do you want to speak to this comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if I look holistically, I think manufacturers are actually leading most of the charge in this space, right?
Yeah.
I think they're the ones that are looking at, their own operations, really identifying new technologies, testing that, and making
Yeah.
those investments at a pace that's, I think, much higher than a brand ask for that to happen right
Yeah.
now. So, certainly that's not true for every manufacturer across the board, but I think really, if you look at where actual emissions are happening right now, it's suppliers that are leading the charge on that. I think rightfully so. Again, we know that if we're gonna get to the targets that we need to hit, that's a big amount of investment, right? And I think there is a big conversation, and rightfully so, around how do we share that cost? And, that can't and shouldn't go entirely onto the supply chain. And we have to think about ways that we do that effectively. From my experience, when we talk to our supply chain about this, a lot of it is really focused back on making sure that we have a level playing field, and that, everyone's kind of being held to the same standards and asking to do the same things, so that people aren't making investments that then kind of become something that makes them non-competitive and, a couple of months later. So making sure that, we have the right incentive structures for those. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, I would say wholeheartedly, suppliers are really taking the reins on a lot of the really good work that we're seeing today.
Yeah, agreed. And for me, that's a change from 5 years ago when we started this work. It was mostly brands setting commitments and throwing it over to suppliers to say, figure out scope 3 or their scope 1, 2. I think that's changing. Clearly, there's still some dynamic in play where, brands may be telling them what to do. But I would just say that there's no way we're going to hit, net zero by no later than 2050 if we're not supporting manufacturers, right, to get there, right? It's just not going to happen. So I think, to Mallory's point, yeah, I think a lot of the leadership is now coming from manufacturers, which is great. We've got maybe another minute. Any other questions before we wrap up? Again, the anonymous attendee, adding burden, adding cost. Again, I think the Transformers report is a good resource. Maybe Leonie, when we send out the recap, we can add that link about different financing mechanisms needs, but also I think it's important to go talk to manufacturers and ask what they need. They may not want debt, or they may not be able to take on debt. I would imagine that a lot of them just want clarity. Are you going to be continuing to buy from me for the next X years if we make this investment? Can you help us with technical support to put on solar? So I think, lots of brands. I mean, Mallory, you mentioned the work you're doing, right? I think brands have programs, they provide support. It's probably very brand specific and manufacturer brand specific.
Yeah, and I would say, and I think I'm allowed to say this in this forum, but I mean, AI is doing a lot of good work in convening around what are the right financial tools for the supply chain. But I think to your point, Michael, there's no one size fits all model. I would say H&M has been leading with some really great work that they've done on green investments in their supply chain, and some models that they're now trying to bring out to industry to say, are there ways that we could be working with banks and development banks to sort of guarantee loans and get lower rates for facilities. IFC is looking at things like, debt funds that would then be able to make loans directly from that at lower rates than maybe you would get from a commercial bank. Again, this whole dynamic is very complex because there's different regulations in terms of banking in different countries where our manufacturers operate. And then I think to your last point, Michael, a lot of times from conversations that I've been in, loans themselves are actually only kind of 10% of the issue or the challenge, and a lot of our larger suppliers are bankable, so it's not actually getting a loan that essentially is the issue, but it's really around making sure that we have the right business incentives in place for people to take those loans. So I think that's kind of the work of the work, is to say it's not just around getting preferred interest rates for suppliers, but really setting a business dynamic in which suppliers are rewarded for making those investments, and doing that with an eye towards long-term partnership.
Yeah, great. Leonie, maybe back to you to close since we're at time.
Yeah.
That was great.
So thanks everyone for participating, for joining and asking many really interesting and great questions. Thanks to our speakers as well for the great presentations. And I'm closing the webinar here. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Really appreciate your questions and time.
Bye-bye. Mhm.